If you look closely at your own hand right now, you might notice a small hangnail or a dry patch of skin. Within seconds, your brain will likely compel you to pick at it, smooth it down, or fiddle with it. It is a tiny, almost invisible act of micromanagement that you don't even realize you're doing. But this quiet, mundane habit of fidgeting with yourself isn't just a nervous tic. It is actually the most important behavioral fossil we have. It is the visible ghost of the very thing that built our species. For decades, we have been told a story about our ancestors that is almost entirely a lie. The myth says that ancient humans were far too busy fighting off saber-toothed cats and searching for berries to ever feel the itch of a dull afternoon. We've been led to believe that every second of prehistoric life was a high-stakes struggle for survival, a 24-hour marathon of fear and labor where leisure was a luxury that didn't exist until the invention of the tractor. But this image of the exhausted, hyper-vigilant caveman is fundamentally backwards. Everything you've been told about the constant struggle of ancient life is wrong. In reality, our ancestors were likely the most bored people to ever walk the earth. And it was that very boredom that acted as the primary engine for every single invention we consider human. You might think that having a lot of free time is a modern invention, a byproduct of our refrigerators and grocery stores. However, the exact opposite is true. In 1966, an anthropologist named Marshall Solins presented a paper that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. He called it the original affluent society. Solins had been looking at data from modern hunter-gatherer groups, like the Kung people of the Kalahari and the Hadza of Tanzania, who still live much like our ancestors did 50,000 years ago. What he found was staggering. These people didn't work 40 hours a week. They didn't even work 20. On average, they spent only 3 to 5 hours a day on what we would call work, the actual gathering of food and maintaining of tools. Once the nuts were gathered and the fire was lit, there was nothing left to do. No emails to check, no lawns to mow, and no news cycles to monitor. This means that for nearly 300,000 years, the human brain evolved in an environment where people had 10 to 12 hours of dead silence to fill every single day. The struggle for survival wasn't a frantic race. It was a slow, quiet, and often agonizingly boring wait for the sun to go down. But while that sounds like a peaceful vacation, it was actually a biological crisis for a brain as complex as ours. You see, the human brain is an energy-hungry machine that hates to sit idle, and when it isn't given a task, it starts to eat itself. This leads us to the second major myth, the idea that ancient art and music were born out of a sudden spiritual awakening or a need to communicate deep religious truths. We look at a 75,000-year-old shell bead and we see a sacred artifact, but we should probably see it as a prehistoric version of a fidget spinner. In the Blombos Cave in South Africa, researcher Christopher Henshelwood and his team found a collection of tiny Nassarius kraussianus shells. These weren't tools for hunting or containers for water. They were beads that had been painstakingly drilled and coated in red ochre. To make just one of these beads, a person had to find the shell, clean it, use a sharp stone to drill a precise hole through it without shattering the fragile casing, and then rub it with pigment. It was a massive investment of time for zero caloric return. If you think those beads were made because of some high-concept artistic vision, you're missing the reality of the cave. These weren't made by people who were inspired. They were made by people who were desperate for something to do with their hands. Imagine sitting in a cave during a 3-day rainstorm with absolutely nothing to look at but the walls. The wow factor here isn't the art itself. It's the fact that humans were so bored, they invented a way to turn trash into treasure just to keep their fingers moving. This is the same origin story for music. In 2008, in the Hohl Fels cave in Germany, archaeologist Nicholas Conrad discovered a flute made from the radius bone of a griffon vulture. It dates back about 40,000 years. This wasn't a simple whistle. It had 5 precisely drilled finger holes and a V-shaped notch at one end for blowing. This took immense skill and hours of carving. You don't invent a 5-hole flute to hunt a mammoth. You invent a flute because the silence of the forest is so loud that you'll do anything to fill it with a new sound. Art and music weren't the goals of humanity. They were the side effects of a brain trying to survive the vacuum of a quiet afternoon. But surely, even if they were making flutes, the real business of being human was the hunt, right? We've been told that language evolved so that men could coordinate complex strategies to take down massive beasts. This is another myth that crumbles under the weight of actual data. It turns out that language wasn't built for the hunt, it was built for the gossip. Robin Dunbar, a renowned evolutionary psychologist at Oxford University, famously argued that language evolved as a more efficient form of social grooming. Monkeys spend hours picking bugs off each other to build bonds, but humans have too many friends for that to work. As our social groups grew to what we now call Dunbar's number, roughly 150 people, we needed a way to groom each other from a distance. And when do you have time to talk? Not when you're sneaking up on a deer. You talk when you're sitting around the fire doing absolutely nothing. Dunbar's research showed that even today, roughly 65% of human conversation is dedicated to social gossip. Who is dating whom, who is trustworthy, and who stole someone else's dried meat. We didn't learn to speak so we could discuss the location of the water hole. We learned to speak because we were bored out of our minds and wanted to talk about our neighbors. This changes the entire timeline of human intelligence. It means that the complexity of your brain isn't a result of smart work, like engineering or hunting. It is a result of thousands of generations of people sitting in circles, telling stories, and speculating about things that didn't exist, simply because talking was the only entertainment available. The myth of the stoic, silent hunter is a fantasy. Our ancestors were likely the most talkative, gossipy creatures to ever exist, turning the void of boredom into the structure of society. But while those conversations were happening, something even stranger was taking place. We often think of games and sports as modern distractions, things we created to get away from the real work of living. But the archaeological record suggests that games are actually older than civilization itself. In prehistoric sites across the globe, researchers find astragali, the knuckle bone of a sheep or goat. In later cultures, these were used as dice, but they appear in the trash heaps of humans long before the first city was ever built. Why would a person living in the Paleolithic keep a specific set of animal joints? Because when you are waiting for a migratory herd to show up and they might be 2 weeks late, you need a way to gamble with fate. The common belief is that these knuckle bones were used for divination, or ritual, because archaeologists love to label anything they don't understand as a ritual. But a much more grounded truth is that they were playing. They were inventing rules and creating stakes where none existed. They were trying to manufacture the stress of a hunt in the safety of the camp just to feel something. Boredom is so painful to the human brain that we will actually choose to create artificial problems just so we can solve them. This is why we have games. It is why we have puzzles. It is why a human 30,000 years ago would sit on a rock and see how many times they could hit a distant tree with a stone. We didn't become masters of our environment because we were hyper-focused on survival. We became masters because we were so bored that we started playing with every stick, stone, and bone we could find until we accidentally discovered how they worked. But if you think that ancient boredom was just a way to pass the time until something better came along, you're missing the most profound biological reality of our species. There is a specific part of your brain called the default mode network, or the DMN. It was identified in 2001 by neurologist Marcus Rachel. The DMN is what turns on when you are doing nothing. When you're staring out a window or lying in the dark or walking a familiar path, your brain doesn't actually shut down. In fact, it starts firing more intensely than when you're focusing on a specific task. This network is responsible for autobiographical memory, for theory of mind, the ability to imagine what someone else is thinking, and most importantly, for future simulation. This is where the myth of the unimaginative ancient human dies. We assume that because they didn't have technology, they didn't have complex inner lives. But the DMN proves that the ancient world of boredom was actually a training ground for the imagination. When a person was sitting in a cave 100,000 years ago, staring at a fire for the 5th hour in a row, their brain wasn't empty. It was simulating. It was asking, what if we go over that mountain? What if the sun never comes back? What if my grandfather is still watching me from the shadows? This is the birth of religion, the birth of philosophy, and the birth of science. These ideas didn't emerge from aha moments during a hunt. They emerged from the long, slow, agonizing hours of doing nothing. The human brain was literally built by the silence of the prehistoric world. Every great idea you've ever had didn't come from your work brain. It came from your bored brain. But here is where the story takes a dark turn, and it's the myth we're currently living in. We believe that we have finally solved the problem of boredom. We have a glowing rectangle in our pockets that ensures we never have to spend a single second alone with our own thoughts ever again. If there is a 3-minute wait for a bus, we check our email. If there is a lull in a conversation, we look at social media. We have successfully eradicated the quiet spaces that Solons, Henshelwood, and Dunbar identified as the literal cradle of our humanity. And in doing so, we might be accidentally shutting down the very machinery that made us smart in the first place. Modern psychology has a term for this: cognitive flickering. Because we are constantly stimulated, our default mode network, the one that thrives on boredom, never gets the chance to fully engage. We are the first generation of humans in 300,000 years to live without boredom. And as a result, we might be the first generation to stop evolving. We think we're being more productive, but we're actually just being more distracted. The person in the cave 75,000 years ago making a bead out of a shell had more mental discipline and a more active imagination than most of us do today, simply because they had no choice but to face the silence. They didn't kill boredom. They used it as a whetstone to sharpen their minds. But even with all our technology, we can't escape our biology. The itch of boredom is still there, lurking under the surface of every scroll and every swipe. You can see it in the way people act online, the constant need to start arguments, to create drama, to pick at the social hangnails of the world. We are still that same creature sitting in the Kalahari, desperately looking for something to do. The only difference is that our ancestors turned that desperation into flutes and stories and societies, while we often turn it into digital noise. We've been taught to fear boredom, to see it as a failure of our time management or a symptom of a lack of ambition. But that is the biggest myth of all. Boredom isn't a bug in the human operating system. It is the core feature. It is the alarm system that tells the brain it is time to create something new. If you think back to that hangnail I mentioned at the beginning, you realize that the urge to pick at it is exactly the same urge that led to the first carved bone and the first painted wall. It's the brain saying, "Give me a problem, or I will make one." The history of humanity is not a history of labor. It is a history of trying to avoid the crushing weight of a quiet afternoon. We are the descendants of the people who didn't just sit there. We are the children of the fidgeters, the gossips, and the gamblers. We are a species that was forged in the fire of having absolutely nothing to do and deciding to do something anyway. But while we've changed our tools, we haven't changed our wiring. The science of the default mode network tells us that your most human moments happen when you are at your least productive. When you're standing in the shower and a solution to a problem suddenly appears, or when you're driving and you suddenly understand a memory from 10 years ago, that is your ancient bored brain finally getting a chance to work. We have spent the last century trying to optimize every second of our lives, thinking that if we can just eliminate the dead time, we will finally be successful. But dead time is the only time the human brain actually lives. The myth of the busy, efficient human is a trap that keeps us from the very boredom that created us. So, when we ask how ancient humans killed boredom, the answer is that they didn't. They let it live. They sat with it until it became so uncomfortable that they had to invent a language to describe it. They looked at it until it became so heavy they had to sing to lighten the load. They played with it until it turned into a game. They didn't kill boredom. They invited it into the cave and made it the guest of honor. And it was that guest that gave us everything we have today. From the tallest skyscraper to the most complex piece of software, everything started because someone somewhere was sitting on a rock with nothing to do and decided to see what would happen if they rubbed two things together. If you really want to understand what it means to be human, you have to stop looking at what people do when they're busy and start looking at what they do when they're not. Because the truth is, the more we try to cure our boredom with distractions, the further we move away from the very thing that made our ancestors so successful. They had the courage to be bored, and we don't. We have traded the deep, creative well of the quiet mind for the shallow, flickering light of constant input. We think we've won because we're never bored, but we've actually lost the most powerful tool in our biological arsenal. But maybe the itch is still there for a reason. Maybe that feeling of restlessness you get when you put your phone down isn't something to be fixed. It's a signal to be followed. It's your brain trying to turn back on the machinery that's been dormant for too long. It's the 75,000-year-old version of you trying to find a shell to drill or a bone to carve. The history of our species proves that whenever humans are bored, something incredible is about to happen. We just have to be brave enough to let the boredom happen. If you think about the most boring thing you did today, did you actually let yourself experience it, or did you reach for your pocket the second the world went quiet? We love to believe we're different from the person sitting in that cave, but the reality is that your brain is still waiting for the exact same thing theirs was. It's waiting for the silence to get loud enough that you finally have to say something new. We've spent 300,000 years running away from boredom, and in that race, we built civilization. But now that we've finally caught up to a world where nothing to do is impossible, we might find that the race was the whole point. The myth that we are meant to be constantly occupied is the most dangerous one we've ever told ourselves. It's a myth that turns us into consumers of other people's boredom rather than creators of our own. The next time you find yourself stuck in a long line or staring at a blank wall, remember that you are participating in the oldest human tradition there is. You are standing in the same mental space as the first artist, the first musician, and the first storyteller. You are in the laboratory of the human soul. And if you can resist the urge to look away, you might just find that the silence has something to tell you. But let's be honest about the reality of your life right now. You are currently staring at a screen, consuming a story about how you shouldn't be staring at a screen. You are seeking information to fill the gap in your day, much like the person in the cave used beads or flutes. We are all still just trying to manage the itch. But there is a massive difference between the boredom that builds a flute and the boredom that scrolls through a feed. One creates a new world, and the other just helps you forget this one. The truth about ancient humans isn't that they were better than us. It's that they were more desperate. They didn't have a choice. They had to be creative because the alternative was a mental void that was too terrifying to face. We have the choice, and we choose the easy path every time. We choose the distraction because the void is still there, and it's still just as scary as it was 100,000 years ago. But the void is also where all the good stuff is. It's where the flutes are. It's where the stories are. It's where you are. So, here is the challenge. The next time you feel that familiar itch of boredom, don't reach for the distraction. Don't kill the moment. Sit with it. Let the default mode network fire up. Let your brain start picking at the hangnails of your life. See what your mind does when it's forced to entertain itself. You might find that you're a lot more like your ancestors than you thought. You might find that the nothing you're so afraid of is actually the everything you've been looking for. After all, we are a species of fidgeters. We are the animals that couldn't just sit still and be content. We had to change everything. We had to make tools and art and music and cities. And we did it all for the same reason you're still listening to this. Because the alternative was just too dull to handle. The myth is that we are the masters of the world. The truth is, we're just the most restless creatures in it. And that restlessness is the only reason you have a world to be bored in at all. What is a myth about ancient history that you've always suspected was true? Or something modern that you think our ancestors would find absolutely ridiculous? Most people believe that our ancestors were primitive because they lacked our technology, but in reality, they were mental giants because they had to build their own entertainment from scratch. If you find yourself more interested in these prehistoric rabbit holes than the latest viral trend, you've already started re-engaging with that ancient part of your brain. The history of boredom is the history of you, and it's a story that's still being written every time you put your phone down. You might think you're in control of your attention, but the truth is you're just a prehistoric brain in a high-tech cage, frantically clicking for a dopamine hit that will never be as satisfying as the first flute ever carved. You spend your life trying to escape the very silence that actually created your ability to think, yet you wonder why you feel so disconnected. The person in the cave wasn't the one who was trapped. You are